If you haven't done so already, go ahead and take a seat. Hey, it's good to be back up front here. If some of you might have been here last week, I was back finally after a great vacation visiting. We went to the beach. We got to visit with some family, but I was away for a couple Sundays, really just trying to enjoy some time with some family and getting to tell stories. I mean, I think that's pretty inevitable. Whenever you got family around, you start going through some of the familiar stories, and one of those stories involves my brother's wedding. Now, they live in Miami, and so 20-some years ago when they were getting married, we flew down there in order to, be there for the celebration. Little did we know we were being recruited into the actual wedding planning of this event. So we got down there a couple days before the wedding, and we were up late every night, printing bulletins and getting stuff ready and entertaining folks and doing trips to the airport. Well, one night we had been up till 4 a.m. trying to get ready. And then the next day was the day of the actual wedding. So the phone rings at 7 a.m. So I'd only gotten 3 hours of sleep at this point. But I'm still kind of an early riser. So I was the first person to claw my way to the phone that was ringing. And I pick it up, and all of a sudden, this avalanche of Spanish comes through the phone line to me on the side, and I'm just I don't know if it's just I woke up wrong or I tried my very best to muster up some response in my mind, and I hold this phone up to my ear and I say, "No parles español," which I took French in high school, so this was some weird blending. It was the Tower of Babel gone wrong. It was some weird mix mash of language. And on the other side, I just hear, "Can you put Ellie on the phone?" At least he's no English. From that statement, he knew we were not going to be speaking in whatever language that was any bit forward. So no communication moving forward at all. Well, have you ever been in a situation like that where you just could not communicate with somebody? There was a language barrier there between, and I know in Wheeling that's probably pretty rare, but maybe you went somewhere and just realized you were unable to communicate with somebody you really needed to talk with. Well, I'm going to say that there is somebody very close to you, maybe closer than you think right now, who is attempting to speak with you, and you cannot understand what they're saying. And because you can't understand, your spiritual growth may be at a standstill. And that person who is so close to you that you can't understand is your very own soul. So one of the ways that we understand that our soul communicates to us is through our emotions. Check out this quote that I found from the book, The Cry of the Soul. This is what it says. It says, "Emotions are the language of the soul. They are the cry that gives our heart a voice." And so if we're here this Sunday morning, either in person or watching online, and we don't really know how our emotions are communicating with us or how they might be trying to tell us things about what's going on inside of us, then we're stuck not understanding this deep part of who we are. And because we don't understand what our souls are saying, we are unable to grow deeper in our faith and more like the person of Jesus. So let's talk about our emotions this Sunday morning. This whole summer, we're going through a series called Reset. It all starts with the soul. And in this series, we're looking at the different parts of who we are as physical, spiritual hybrids that we call human beings. And in this, we're loosely going through a book called The Transforming of the Heart by Dallas Willard. And in that book, he gives 6 different areas of who we are. So as human beings, we're broken down into, we can understand ourselves in terms of our thoughts, in terms of our feelings, and in terms of our choices, our physical body, our social context, the relationships that we have, and all of that gets kind of tied together in this thing we call the soul or the self that brings all of that together and makes you who you are. And so by looking at that, we understand that we're complex people, and yet our souls desire us to be simple, for us to have a unity in our thoughts and feelings and our choices that genuinely express who we are. And when we find that true authenticity within ourselves, we feel that we're living a genuine life, the life that God has designed us to live. But a lot of times, the parts inside of us, they're all mixed up, and we don't understand that. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to our emotions. And so we're going to talk about emotions today, and they are a difficult thing to understand. I mean, I even got online and Googled some basic definitions for emotions, and it seems like even Google can't understand feelings. I mean, go figure. So let me just define what an easy way for us to understand emotions first, and then we'll kind of take a look at what we're going to understand about them today. But when you think about emotions, I like to think about the word. You got E and motion. And so that's a simple way for us to understand that our emotions are that part of us that drive us to or away from the things in our physical environment, even our thoughts. You know, they give our lives motion. Interestingly, if you've ever read in the old King James Version, it talks about how Jesus was moved by his emotions, moved by his compassion. Here's an example. This is Matthew 14:14. In the King James, and it says, Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion towards them. And so that's a simple way for us to understand what our feelings are. They energize us. And positive feelings energize us toward things, so like love and joy and compassion move us out towards those objects. And the negative feelings, fear and anger, move us away or in a detrimental way from the things in our physical environment. But if you just pause and understand that little bit about what I'm talking about today, you'll understand how important our emotions are, because they drive a lot of our life. And to live without them is to live this kind of passionless, dry toast life, which I don't think is ultimately satisfying and will, I think, inevitably lead us to be tempted away from what we know is the good, because we're finding something more exciting somewhere else. So we need to learn how to talk to and understand our emotions. And we're going to do that today by looking at 3 possible responses that we can have to our emotions. And I think these are probably the most common responses that we have. And they all start with I, because it's really clever and memorable, right? So number 1, how can we respond to our emotions? Well, we can try to ignore them, simply deny them, stuff our feelings, right? Rub some dirt in it. Those are all classic ways that we try to ignore our feelings. Second, we can indulge them. The heart wants what it wants, right? So that's another very common approach to our feelings in our culture today. And then finally, the one I hope you're going to see is the biblical way, which is we need to learn how to inform our feelings. That we need to understand the relationship between our thought life and the mental maps that we make up here that we talked a little bit about last week, and how those mental maps gear us up to have certain feelings about things in our environment. And that doesn't mean we could just command our feelings and make them turn on a dime. That's not what this is saying, but we can set ourselves up to feel better by the kind of thoughts and information that we surround our lives in. And that's basically going to be my big idea for today's message, which is that if you inform your emotions, you will transform your life. That if we frame ourselves through what God says about us in the way that he describes us as his children who are dearly loved and forgiven in Christ, we'll set ourselves up to experience the good emotions of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. But if our mental world isn't that, we're very likely to travel down some very dark emotional paths and experience a lot of the negative feelings that the Bible doesn't say glorify God when they're overindulged. So let's take a look at those three responses, see where you might be, and hopefully I can move you towards that third one of informing our emotions. So let's start with the first one, ignoring our emotions. And this is a way of dealing with feelings which I am very familiar with, and I'm just going to step out on a limb and say probably a lot of guys growing up in this area are familiar with this format of dealing with our feelings, because that's the rub the dirt in it mentality. You know, that's the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, push those things aside, and then let's just get stuff done. And that was certainly me for a long, long time. And if you've been here at C3 for, I don't know, maybe a decade or so, you might remember that there was a season here where Adam lovingly referred to me as the non-hugging pastor, which I don't know if that was, some seminary class that I missed somewhere, like the hugging 101, but he would joke about how I was I guess he and Tim were the hugging pastors. I was the non-hugging pastor. And in that season of my life, I didn't really understand what was going on inside of me. Most of my feelings I kept on pushed way down, except with the rare exception, well, not actually rare, of anger. So for a lot of guys who ignore their feelings, we don't really know what's going on inside of us, but it still builds up until a point where the only pressure relief that we have is anger. And so I lived with a lot of confusion about what I was feeling and a lot of anger towards the people I loved and maybe even towards maybe some people even here on a Sunday morning as I'm busily running around trying to do things, felt that from my facial expressions that I was somehow angry at them. But through the grace of God and the loving kindness of my wife, we've moved to a better place over the last couple years. Than that, I've started to understand a little bit more about what's going on the inside, and I think really mended and done a lot of good work in all of my relationships, the closest ones to me, my relationship with my own soul, kids, other people. I'll hug you now, for a small fee, so just changing my understanding of myself has been a great transformation. But it's not just, now listen, it's not just an emotional thing. And I think that's our problem as church. We think this is just an optional thing if we want to grow spiritually. It'd be nice to have that, but it's not essential. But I have gotten more and more convinced over the years that it is inseparable, your spiritual health and your emotional health. That you cannot be emotionally unhealthy and spiritually healthy. And I've read a lot since then about this, and one particular book has really hit the nail on the head on this topic, which is a book called Emotionally Healthy Church by Peter Cesario. And in this book, he talks about a very similar path that I was on as a pastor, just kind of being closed off and burning a lot of bridges and relational trouble and just not really considering myself very spiritual, but really kind of an emotional train wreck all at the same time. And in this book, he describes people that he's encountered or he's imagining exist in churches who think they're very spiritually healthy, but emotionally they're not. I'm just going to read through this list. And this is not a list of people at C3, so don't be looking around. This is from his book. So if any likeness to anybody here as a church is purely coincidental at this point, all right? So here's some things that he lists. And I think a lot of us, if you've grown up in church, you probably know these people. He says, here are people who are trying to be spiritually healthy, but emotionally not. It's people like a certain board member, trustee, deacon, or elder who never says, I'm sorry, and never admits that they were wrong. Or maybe it's a children's church leader who's constantly criticizing others all around them. Maybe it's a middle-aged father with 2 toddlers secretly addicted to pornography. Or a 35-year-old husband busily serving in the church, but he's unaware of how lonely his wife is at home. Maybe it's that tireless servant at church who volunteers for 4 different ministries, but rarely takes personal time to care for himself or herself. Or it's that person who's always at the prayer meetings, who uses prayer as a means to escape from the painful reality of their marriage. Or it's members of a small group who are never transparent about their struggles and difficulties until it's too late. All of these people can be like us, striving to be so spiritual, but deep underneath, there's something wrong that we haven't quite connected. And so if you haven't gotten it by now, I'm trying to convince you of the simple fact that if you cannot be spiritually mature if you're emotionally immature. Those things can't happen because sooner or later, what's wrong and what's underneath is going to come out, and it's going to hurt the people around you. And I don't know why it took me so long as a pastor to actually come to terms with this reality, because now that I understand this and I go back and I read the Bible, I see that this is one of the main things that Jesus criticized the spiritual people about his day about, because Jesus' most frequent term that he would use to describe the Pharisees, which were like the ultra-spiritual group of his day, was that he called them hypocrites, which was just a first century word for someone who put on a mask and went and did a Greek or a Roman play, right? Someone who had a veneer on the outside that did not match their inward reality. So they had a real spiritual exterior, but an unspiritually tamed and informed emotional life. And now that I realize that, I read passages like Matthew 23, 27 to 28, and I realize this is exactly what Jesus is looking them at the eye and talking about it. Notice what he says. Here's kind of his famous rant on the Pharisees. He says, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, outwardly appearing beautiful, but inside you're full of dead people's bones and all kinds of grottiness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." And I love that Jesus chooses that word for the last one, that inside they were breaking the law. Because for the Pharisees, they're like, we never break the rules, right? We're always keeping the rules. We're always doing what's right. Yeah, on the outside, but inside, they've never informed their emotions based off of what God says about them. And so inside, they're a bunch of lawbreakers, which would have totally blown their mind. And I think they're a picture of people trying to be spiritually mature, but emotionally, they are immature. And it's easy to fool people who are far away from you, right? So, I mean, you can keep up the veneer of being a hypocrite for a while. I mean, a lot of people in Jesus' day looked up to the Pharisees and thought, oh man, this is what it means to be spiritual. But where it gets you is the people who are closest to you. And I'm going to wrap up this part of my message just with this last plea to you, church. Because where this is going to wreck us is not only in our homes, but especially for the next generation. That unless we get some understanding of our emotional health as a church, even if we don't immediately see the cost of it, we're going to see it in our kids and our grandkids. I was reading an article recently called Losing Our Religion by Russell Moore. And if you don't know Russell Moore, he's a famous ethicist. He was the Southern Baptist conventions. He ran their board for like ethics and public policy for a while until just recently. But he wrote this article, and I would recommend reading it if you're into that, called Losing Our Religion. And he talks about how when he was 15 years old, growing up in Mississippi, how he attempted suicide at that young age because he was a young believer, but he just saw the hypocrisy in the church members all around him. And it actually drove him to despair and to want to take his own life. And he says this is what he saw. He saw parents who would beat their children for listening to secular music and then show up and smile on Sundays. He saw people in his church who publicly denounced vulgarity but then would get in the car and yell all kinds of racial slurs out of the window. He saw people at church making endless predictions about who was the Antichrist. Back in the day, that was Mikhail Gorbachev. That dates him, right? But when they were wrong, they never apologized. There was no coming clean about it. They just moved on to their next thing as if nothing happened. And he just saw this inconsistency, and he just couldn't take it anymore. And he feels like that kind of reality is back, and it's driving young people away from the church. And this is the quote that he said that I thought was just so powerful. He says this. He says, we now see young evangelicals walking away from evangelicalism, not because they do not believe what the church teaches, but because they believe that the church itself does not believe what the church teaches. They're looking at what we say on the outside, and they're looking at what's inside, and they say, you do not believe it, and they're walking away. And I think the only way for us to address this is to take a good, hard look at our souls as a church, and that means we have to address this issue of emotions, and simply ignoring them is not going to get it done. So that's the first way we can not deal with what's going on inside of us. We can ignore our feelings. And that's not going to work. And then the second way is to simply indulge in our feelings. One response is just to give in to these feelings. And I want us to try to understand this just for a moment before we denounce this particular viewpoint, because I know this one probably doesn't resonate with church folks a lot, but let's try to understand this for a moment. You know, if our emotions are the language of our soul, then you can understand why people who desire to live an authentic and genuine life would want to listen to what's going on deep inside of them. And I think we need to understand that there is a desire for authenticity that can stand behind this want to just indulge with whatever seems to be bubbling up within us, because they want to be true to their souls. And that's not altogether bad, right? We can't just throw that out with everything else, because that's a genuine desire that they have to try to be true to who they are. Now, the problem is that if all we do is indulge in our feelings, we're really putting feelings in the driver's seat of our lives. And even though the Bible says our feelings are important, it doesn't say that they should rule over everything that we're doing. And in fact, in certain parts of the Bible, it warns that if we put them in the driver's seat, we may not do well emotionally, and our souls may not prosper. This is really quick. Proverbs 25:28 that warns about this kind of life. It says, a man or a person without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. And so if you don't have some level of self-control, if you're always indulging in those feelings, you're like a broken down city, right? Because cities in those days, they needed walls to protect them from marauders. And so the defenses that you have are just not there. And so you're vulnerable, right, is what it's saying, that you're vulnerable when you just overindulge in your feelings. And in fact, later on in the New Testament, Paul, who founded a number of churches, writes to the church in Rome about how if we just are always giving in to our feelings, it actually doesn't lead us to a path of life, but it kind of enslaves us to the chaotic nature of what's going on inside of us. And he writes about those things in Romans 8, chapter 8, verses 5 and 6, where he talks about living life according to the flesh or the spirit. And this is what he says. He says, for those who live according to the flesh, they set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Because if you set your mind on the flesh, on those desires, that's death. but the mind set on the Spirit offers life and peace. So if we only indulging in what all of our feelings are saying to us all the time, we end up moving down the path that isn't life and peace. It's always chaotic. It's always changing. It doesn't provide the consistency that our soul desires. It was never designed to do that. It won't offer us a genuine life. And just to pause and kind of give the big picture here, when we talk about a well-ordered soul, and we're going to be talking about this throughout our series, when we talk about a well-ordered soul, this is ultimately the framework that we want you to understand, that the way God has geared up all these various parts inside us to work is that God will rule over our lives, right? That's what it means to be a Christ follower, right? We deny ourselves and we follow him. We give him that ultimate place of authority in our lives. And from that, God informs our choices, right? We deny self and we follow him. We give our will to God. And then our will informs our thoughts. So we choose what we're going to think about. That was the last 2 Sundays' messages, right? So God informs our will then chooses our mental maps, our thoughts, and then our thoughts will inform our emotions. This is how we see the order of the well-ordered soul. Not putting emotions at the top, but not necessarily ignoring them either. We just want to inform our emotions so that we can set them up for a better success, right? And so that's the third point, right? We're not going to ignore our feelings. We're not going to just indulge in them. We're going to inform our emotions. And like I said earlier, this doesn't mean that we just command our feelings. You know, I feel like a lot of times this is how we hear this, like informing our feelings. We just interpret it as another way of ignoring them. And I see this a lot in Christian circles when somebody comes up to another believer and they're talking about how they feel sad or they feel disappointed or they have some dark feeling, and a well-meaning brother or sister says, well, just feel better. like just feel differently. And anytime we use the word just when we're talking to somebody else about their feelings, all we're really telling them is, I don't know anything about feelings. Like all the information you've disclosed at that moment is this realm of feelings is something you know absolutely nothing about, because there's no just feeling better if you've ever experienced some dark nights of the soul. We do not have the ability to simply command our feelings on the dot. The Bible nowhere says that is something that our wills can do. So the best thing that we can do is control the way that we think about things, and in that way we set ourselves up to frame our lives for better emotional health. And so the person who is informing their feelings is intentionally every single day choosing God's truth as the mental map of their life, and by setting those things up intentionally every single day, they're gearing their days up for better feelings. And I know this is probably an imperfect example, but I'll use it. When we're talking about it, informing our feelings, I want you to think about a sailboat, right? Okay, so our lives are, we're out on the water, and things are just changing all the time. And so what do we do when we inform our feelings is we turn the mast of the boat in a certain direction and we hoist the sail up. Now, we can't make the wind blow, right? We can't force the wind to blow, but we can certainly gear everything up so that when change happens, we're geared up to catch it and to push us in the direction that we know that we need to be on. That's what it means to inform our feelings. And one of the ways that we talked last week that we want to inform our feelings is by giving ourselves the mental map that we live and serve under a God who abundantly provides for his people. If you were here last week, you know last week's big idea was a simple truth I wanted to remind you throughout the week, which was, my God provides well for me. And if we would take that piece of truth that God has given us through his word, from Psalm 23 and what Jesus says about God being a good father who provides for his children, and geared that up as the way that we saw the world, we said we would be better geared up to live the life that God has for us. And I think now that we're talking about emotions, you can see how living in that kind of framework does gear our lives up to feel the positive emotions that God describes he wants believers to have: love, joy, peace, patience. Because on the opposite side of that, we talked about this last week, I think a lot of Christians, even though we profess how abundant God is on Sunday, we go out throughout the week and live in this scarcity mentality where it seems like keeping our lives safe is all up to us. You know, we'll talk a good game on Sunday, but then we leave here and we go out and we act as though it's all on our shoulders for us to provide everything for ourselves. And you listen to people talking like that, and there's just no God in their mental dialogue when it comes to certain issues. And we talked about it's the kind of things that we watch or listen to, or if we indulge in fear that clouds our thinking, and we just get in this it's all up to me orphan mentality instead of living as God's children who are generously provided for. And so if we live in a scarcity mentality, we're going to feel bad, and we're going to indulge in the kinds of feelings that the Bible describes are the works of the flesh. In probably the most famous part of the Bible that deals with feelings, Galatians 5, it gives a list of how God doesn't want our emotions to exist. And when you think about this scarcity mentality, you're going to look at this list and see how, maybe not directly every single thing, but the majority of the things on this list come from a mental map that says, I'm left to provide for me. Me and my resources are all that's going to keep me safe in the universe. So here's this scarcity mindset from Galatians 5. Look at some of the things that are listed here and see the connection between these things. So here Paul's writing to the church in Galatia, and he says, the works of the flesh are sensuality. So if this life is all there is, then indulging in my feelings, what feels good, is all that there is in this life. That's sensuality or strife. You see, when there's not enough resources in the world for everybody, life becomes a tug of war with other people, and so I engage in strife. Or jealousy. Because in a limited world, if you have something, then I don't. Your gain is my loss. Fits of anger. See, it's just not for pastors anymore, right? Right? If I'm all alone in the world and somebody stands in my way, the only response that I think I have at my resources is to get angry with them because it's all on me. Or rivalries, right? When there's a limited pie, divide and conquer, right? That's what our world's all about. Or envy. If there's only so much in the world, I have to have what you have. Or drunkenness. If in the end all that there is this life, then all I can do is drown my bad feelings through alcohol. And again, not that every one of these perfectly lines up with the scarcity mindset, but you can see how thinking that way is going to lead to this kind of living as opposed to the other list that Paul gives in Galatians 5, which are called the fruit of the Spirit. So we can live in a different mental world than it's all up to me by trusting that God is our good Father who provides for us. Jesus says that God is so intimately aware of your needs that he's counted every hair on top of your head, which is an illustration I can use, but Pastor Adam can't. Like God doesn't know him very well. Like God is so closely acquainted with your problems. Jesus even says at one point, even when you're about to pray, he already knows what you need. Not that he doesn't want you to pray, but he doesn't want you to pray out of a sense that he isn't already surrounding your situation in his loving kindness. So when that's your mental framework, you're going to be a person who learns to love because you sense that God's love surrounds you. You're going to be a person whose life is filled with joy because no matter what circumstance you're facing, my God provides well for me. And so in moments where nobody else might experience joy, there you are, trusting that God's good solution is waiting on the other side. You're going to live as a person of peace because you know that you're cared for. And that doesn't change when circumstances change because God's truth is consistent. You're going to be a person who's patient because you've already submitted your life to God and his timing. And so you're not operating in this world like a little mini God trying to control everything in your environment. You'll be a person who shows kindness and goodness because God provides for me. I can give things away towards others. I don't have to hoard everything in my life. You can be a person of faithfulness and gentleness because when God's providing for me, I don't have to treat people in my life as means to an end. I can honor them as God-given creations made in his image, and so I can treat them with gentleness and respect. And ultimately, I'll be a person with self-control because I'm not just indulging in my feelings, I'm living submitted to God, and I trust his timing for everything. Now, there's lots of truths that God speaks over our lives through his son, Jesus. Lots of gospel truths that we could daily be framing our existence with. And that God provides well for me is a good one. It's a great summary. It's not all of the gospel truth, but it is one that I think, in particular, in today's day and age, helps us live a little bit differently. And it's helped me tremendously. Over the past couple weeks, and I think I talked about this in my last message, dealing with anxiety in my own life and trying to reframe my own daily existence through trusting that God is going to provide for me, I've noticed a change in myself. And this is a stupid example, but hey, it's late, so we're up for one. But at Kroger's a couple weeks ago, they're understaffed there horribly. And so there was just no shopping carts to be found. So I dig one out and I do my shopping. I walk it out to the car. And normally in the parking lot, once I get my stuff loaded, I just shoot that cart out, man. I'm that guy. Like, I see those things in the parking lot. I'm like, I think I can get it between the uprights. What do you think? Shove it off there. Might have hit your car, I don't know, but just send it off and forget it. And I pause and I realize for me, especially in certain places like Kroger or at stoplights, I feel like my time is very limited. Like nobody wants to be there for longer than they want to be. And so we gear ourselves up to be less compassionate because I got to rush. I got to take care of me. But I didn't, and I paused and I walked the cart back. Not a big deal, it's just a small thing. One of the employees there, clearly overwhelmed, paused and said, "Thank you. Thank you for doing that." And I'm like, this is such a simple thing to do. This is not impossible. And yet it provided a change in me. And I'm not great at other things, but in this moment, that was noticeable to someone and was different enough for them to actually remark about it. And that same thing can happen in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different interactions that you're going to have today with all the people in your life if we begin to inform our emotions. And so let's do that. Let's become a thick-souled people who are truly different than what's going on in the rest of the Christian world, a truly transformed place that is pursuing Jesus and desiring to be his followers. And we got to do it through taking our next steps. So here's a couple things this week that I'm asking you to consider. If you haven't already come up with what your next step is, please consider these. So Number one, and this is obvious, this is kind of coming off of last week, begin each day with a framework of abundance, however that works for you. If you have a morning time when you read or reflect, perfect. Use that. If you're just a little more rushed and you can stick something on a mirror where you shave or you get ready in the morning, great. Maybe it's reciting Psalm 23, which we talked about last week, in your mind so that you kind of have this sense that, my cup does overflow. God does provide abundantly for me. Figure out a way to have that as part of your daily routine. And then just don't leave it there. As you're interacting, as you're entering into situations where you're going to feel limited, speak that truth over your life. Secondly, I encourage you to go back and go through Galatians chapter 5. It's two different lists of two different emotional worlds that we can live in. And I think if you've lived kind of ignoring your emotions for a while, reading through this list and simply asking yourself the question, what's going on under the surface for me? What am I really feeling inside? And using this list as a way to just say, you know what, I think I'm feeling some anger. I think I'm feeling some enmity, or I think I'm living in some jealousy right now. And just being able to label what's going on inside of you through looking through this might be a healthy first step for you just to get a little more well-versed in the language of your soul. But whatever step you take, you have to move forward. Emotions are not optional. And if you desire to be spiritually healthy and to follow after Jesus, who said that the greatest commandments were to love God and love other people, if those are the two commands that Jesus gives, we cannot do those and be emotionally stunted as his followers. We have to understand what is going on inside of us. And I know for a lot of us, we feel like, no, emotions are optional. Christianity is about doing and duty and doing the right things. And I'll tell you this, I will warn you of it again. If you think you can just drag yourself through the desert of duty, sooner or later, either you will get tripped up into something that is more exciting and more captivating than just doing the duty, or those around you who are close, including the next generation, will look at the lifelessness of that faith and simply move on. Emotions are not optional. So how do we deal with them? Well, we can't simply ignore them and just say that they don't exist, and we can't swing the pendulum the other way and just indulge in every single feeling that we have. We have to find a place where we can inform our feelings in order to transform our lives. And when we do that, we'll become more like Jesus, whose number one emotion that the Bible records that he had is compassion. That he was moved by his compassion towards the needs of others, and that's what drove him to do what he did. That's what drove ultimately the story of God for him to come and send his son for us, because he saw our needs and he was moved by his emotions, and it drove him to do something about it. And that has made all the difference for us. It is our salvation. So let's be more like that, and let's transform our lives as we inform our emotions. Please pray with me. Father, thank you again for the opportunity to take a look inside of our souls and to understand this fearful and wonderfully designed spiritual, physical hybrid that you've created us to be, and just to examine that, because for many of us, we've just never really taken a deep look within. We just take life as granted, and we haven't done the hard work, the inner work, to be transformed by your words. So I pray that today we would look at that language of our soul, our feelings, and begin to move and structure them in a way that honors and glorifies you and reflects Jesus, the one who has shown us so much compassion. And we pray this in his name. Amen.